March 1946, Seagoville, Texas. The sun hung low over the prairie, casting long shadows across the POW camp's wooden barracks. Yumi Tanaka sat on the edge of a rough-hewn cot, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the worn floorboards beneath her feet. The air smelled of dust and hay and something else she couldn't name, something that felt impossibly foreign after years of war. She had been told that surrender meant the end of everything, that captivity in American hands would bring only brutality and shame. But as footsteps approached her door, steady and unhurried, she braced herself not for cruelty, but for something far more terrifying: kindness. If you're moved by stories of resilience, humanity, and unexpected grace in the darkest of times, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices back to life. And if you believe history should be remembered with honesty and heart, subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. The door creaked open. A man stepped inside, his boots scuffing softly against the wood. He wore faded denim and a cowboy hat, his face weathered by sun and wind. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her with steady, quiet eyes. Then he set a tin cup of water on the small table beside her cot, nodded once, and walked away. No words, no demands, no disgust, just water. And in that moment, Yumi felt something inside her crack open, a place she had sealed shut years ago, convinced it could never be touched again. To understand what brought Yumi Tanaka to a Texas POW camp in 1946, you have to rewind to 1942. She was 13 years old when the officers came to her village on the northern coast of Honshu. They wore crisp uniforms and spoke in clipped, formal tones about duty, about service to the empire, about honor. They'd promised her family she would work in a factory, that she would help the war effort, that she would return home when victory came. Her mother wept, her father said nothing, and Yumi, too young to understand what was being taken from her, believed them. She was sent to a comfort station in occupied Manchuria. By the time she arrived, she understood. The walls were thin. The air was thick with despair. The other girls, some younger than her, some older, moved through the rooms like ghosts, their faces blank, their voices silent. Yumi learned quickly that survival meant shutting off every part of herself that felt human. She learned not to cry, not to speak, not to hope. She became a number, a body, a tool. The soldiers who used her never asked her name. They never looked at her face. And she learned to believe that this was all she would ever be. For 4 years, Yumi lived in a world where kindness was a weapon and cruelty was routine. She watched girls disappear, some sent to other stations, some to hospitals, some simply gone. She watched the war grind on, relentless and indifferent, and she waited for it to end. Not because she believed freedom would come, but because she didn't know how much longer she could survive. By 1945, she weighed less than 90 pounds. Her body was covered in scars. Her mind was a fortress of silence. And when Japan surrendered in August, when the news crackled over the radio and the soldiers stood in stunned disbelief, Yumi felt nothing. The war was over. But for her, the nightmare had only changed shape. American forces arrived in Manchuria in late 1945, tasked with repatriating Japanese nationals and managing the chaotic aftermath of surrender. Yumi was among hundreds of women found at the comfort stations, women the U.S. military didn't quite know what to do with. They weren't soldiers. They weren't civilians in the traditional sense. They were survivors of a system so brutal, so systematically dehumanizing, that many American officers struggled to comprehend it. Some women were sent back to Japan. Others were held in temporary camps while officials sorted through the legal and logistical tangles. And a small number, like Yumi, were classified as prisoners of war and transported to internment camps in the United States. Yumi arrived at Seagoville in March 1946. She had been told by her Japanese handlers, even in the final days of the war, that American soldiers were monsters, that they would torture her, rape her, kill her, that surrender meant a fate worse than death. So when the truck rolled through the gates of the Texas camp and she stepped out into the dry, blistering heat, she expected hell. Instead, she found wooden barracks, orderly rows of tents, and men in cowboy hats who didn't shout at her, didn't strike her, didn't even touch her. They just pointed her toward a building and told her in broken Japanese to rest. She didn't understand. She couldn't. And so she sat on that cot, waiting for the cruelty to begin. The first week was the hardest. Yumi moved through the camp like a shadow, her eyes downcast, her body tense, waiting for the inevitable. But the violence never came. Instead, there were routines, meals at set times, work assignments that felt almost mundane: cleaning, laundry, sorting supplies. The guards didn't leer at her. They didn't corner her in hallways or whisper threats. They treated her like she was ordinary. It was disorienting, terrifying even, because if they weren't going to hurt her, what did they want? Daniel Wright was a ranch hand from West Texas, 32 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor that made him almost invisible among the louder, brasher men in the camp. He had been hired as civilian labor after the war, helping manage the logistics of the POW facilities. He wasn't a soldier. He'd been exempt from service due to a childhood injury, but he understood hard work, and he understood animals. And somehow, in a way he couldn't quite explain, he understood Yumi. He noticed her on her third day. She was standing by the mess hall, holding a tray of food, but not eating, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for an exit. Daniel watched her for a moment, then walked over, set a tin cup of water beside her, and walked away without a word. It became a pattern. Every day he'd find her somewhere by the barracks, near the laundry line, sitting alone on a bench, and he'd leave something small, a cup of water, a piece of bread. Once, a wildflower he'd picked on his way into camp. He never asked for anything, never spoke, just left the offering and walked away. Yumi didn't understand him. She had spent years learning that men only gave when they wanted something in return. But Daniel never came back to collect. He never lingered. He never watched her with expectation. And slowly, against every instinct she had, she began to trust the small gestures. She began to take the water, to eat the bread, to hold the flour in her hands long after it wilted. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, kindness could exist without cruelty hiding behind it. The other cowboys noticed. Some of them teased Daniel, asked him what he was doing, why he bothered with that Jap girl. But Daniel never responded. He just kept working, kept moving through the camp with that same quiet steadiness. And the teasing eventually stopped, replaced by something else, a grudging respect, maybe, or at least a recognition that Daniel Wright didn't do anything without a reason, even if he never explained what it was. One afternoon in late April, Yumi was working in the camp garden, pulling weeds under the supervision of an older guard. Daniel walked by, tipped his hat, and said, "You're doing a good job." It was the first time he'd spoken to her directly. His voice was low, unhurried, with a soft Texas drawl that made the words feel almost like music. Yumi froze, her hand still in the dirt. She didn't look up, didn't respond, but her heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. And when he walked away, she sat back on her heels and realized she was crying, not from fear, not from pain, but from something she couldn't name. By May, the camp had settled into a strange kind of normalcy. The war was over. Japan was occupied. The prisoners at Seagoville were no longer enemy combatants. They were just people waiting for repatriation, for paperwork, for the slow machinery of bureaucracy to decide their fates. Yumi had begun to speak a few words of English, taught to her by a Red Cross volunteer who visited the camp twice a week. She learned thank you and water and please, small words, but they felt enormous. They felt like reclaiming a voice she'd thought was lost forever. Daniel started sitting with her during the evening breaks, when the heat of the day had passed and the sky turned gold and pink over the prairie. He didn't talk much, just asked her simple questions, gave her space to answer or not. He told her about his ranch, about the horses he raised, about the wide-open spaces of West Texas where you could ride for hours and never see another soul. Yumi listened, her English too broken to respond with more than a word or two, but she listened. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a world beyond survival, a world where she could breathe. One evening, another cowboy, a man named Harris, loud and rough-edged, cornered Yumi near the barracks. He didn't touch her, but his words cut like blades. "You think just because you're here, you're one of us? You're not. You're nothing." Yumi's breath caught. The old fear surged back, cold and paralyzing. But before she could respond, Daniel stepped between them. His voice was quiet but firm. "That's enough, Harris." Harris sneered. "What, you defending her now? After everything she's been?" Daniel didn't flinch. "You don't know her. You don't know what she's been through, and you don't get to decide what she is." The confrontation lasted only a few seconds. Harris muttered something under his breath and walked away. But for Yumi, it was a turning point. Daniel had defended her, not because he wanted something, not because he pitied her, but because he believed she was worth defending. She looked up at him, her eyes wet, and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, his expression soft. "You don't have to thank me, Yumi. You're a person. You deserve respect." That night, alone in her barracks, Yumi wrote her first letter home. She hadn't spoken to her family since 1942. She didn't even know if they were alive. But she wrote anyway, her hand shaking as she formed the characters. She told them about the camp, about the kindness she had found, about the cowboy who had shown her that not all men were cruel. She folded the letter carefully, unsure if she would ever send it, but the act of writing it felt like a kind of healing, a reclaiming of her story. Weeks became months. By late summer, Yumi had gained weight. Her face had lost some of its hollowness. She laughed once, a small, tentative sound, when one of the younger guards made a joke about the Texas heat. It was the first time anyone in the camp had heard her laugh. Daniel heard it from across the yard, and he smiled. Not a big smile, just a small upturn at the corner of his mouth. But it was enough. Yumi began to imagine a future. Not a grand future, not a fairy tale, but something real. She imagined returning to Japan, facing her family, finding a way to live again. She imagined telling her story not with shame, but with the quiet dignity she had slowly started to reclaim. And she imagined, though she barely allowed herself to think it, staying in touch with Daniel, writing letters, remembering the man who had shown her that kindness didn't have to come with conditions. In September, the repatriation orders came. Yumi was to return to Japan in October, along with the other remaining prisoners. She had known it was coming, but the reality of it hit her hard. She didn't want to leave. Not because she loved the camp, she didn't, but because leaving meant saying goodbye to the place and the person who had helped her become whole again. The night before she left, Daniel found her sitting by the edge of the camp, looking out at the darkening sky. He sat down beside her, his hat in his hands. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Daniel said, "You've come a long way, Yumi." She nodded, her throat tight. "Because of you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, because of you. I just reminded you of what was already there." Yumi reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter she had written months ago. She handed it to him. "Will you send this to my family?" Daniel took it, his fingers careful. "Of course." She looked at him, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." He met her gaze, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. "You're going to be okay, Yumi. I know it." Yumi left Segoville on October 12, 1946. She boarded a ship in San Francisco, bound for Yokohama, along with hundreds of other Japanese nationals. The journey took 3 weeks. She spent most of it on deck, watching the ocean, thinking about the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. When she arrived in Japan, her family was waiting. They didn't recognize her at first, but when they did, her mother collapsed into tears. Her father stood silent, his face unreadable. And Yumi, for the first time in years, allowed herself to be held. The letter she had written made its way through military channels, eventually reaching her family weeks after her return. It caused a stir. A Japanese woman, a former comfort girl, speaking of kindness from American captors. It was almost unthinkable. Some family members were ashamed, others were angry. But Yumi's younger sister read it, and she understood. She understood that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about reclaiming your humanity, piece by piece, until you could look in the mirror and recognize yourself again. Yumi never saw Daniel write again, but she wrote to him once, a year later, a short letter in broken English thanking him for teaching her that she was worthy of love. Daniel kept the letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, and every time he looked at it he remembered the woman who had survived the unimaginable, and who had taught him, in turn, that courage didn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looked like a girl sitting on a cot, reaching for a cup of water, and daring to believe she deserved it. In the decades that followed, Yumi built a quiet life. She married, had children, worked as a teacher in a small town outside Tokyo. She never spoke publicly about her past, but she lived with a kind of grace that people noticed, a gentleness, a refusal to meet cruelty with cruelty. And when her grandchildren asked her, late in her life, what had given her the strength to survive, she told them about a cowboy in Texas who had shown her that love didn't have to be earned. It just had to be believed in. She died in 2003 at the age of 74, surrounded by family, and on her knit stand, folded carefully in a small wooden box, was a single dried wildflower, the one Daniel had given her in the spring of 1946. A reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness can crack open the hardest hearts, and that sometimes the most unlikely people can teach us what it means to be human again.